So, Chris, tell me about your current role.
So currently I am working, I suppose, as a learning and development executive at a defense industry prime. It's a UK and Australia centric, also KSA. So I'm, I suppose, I wouldn't say a senior executive, right? So I would say I'm in an executive global position. Really, what I do is I really try to look after the learning development strategy for our workforce of say circa 110,000 people worldwide. And predominantly, I really like to drill down into policy governance. Sounds boring, but it isn't. Um, Policy and governance around our learning strategy. So yeah, that's what I do now.
And tell me about your background that led you into this role, because that's quite an interesting story.
Yeah, actually, I don't have a long sort of history in the sort of corporate environment. Probably about 5 years in now, but actually leading up to that, I've got I suppose a lifelong military background, very much public service centered. So I did 19 years in the British Army initially, and then I moved across to the Australian Defence Force. So I moved down to Australia at the back end of 2018. I spent 5 wonderful years down in Australia, but then for a sort of family reasons, I moved back to the UK. So really around that transition period, it kind of forced me to start thinking about other avenues to take. And what I find is um, a lot of people in the military, I mean, I know you've got a military background yourself, a lot of people don't really know how those skills are going to translate. Okay, what is it that I can do from here? What am I able to do? What am I ready to do? And for me, I really hooked into the military instructor side of life, and I've managed to, I suppose, successfully, being a subjective term, but successfully bridge that sort of military instruction background into a somewhat successful civilian career in a corporate environment.
So, your passion for, I guess, the personal and professional development, do you think that came from military instruction, or was that just something you've always been super interested in? I know I asked this because we've always had such great chats around personal and professional development. So, was that before your military instruction, or did the military instruction really kindle that?
Yeah, I actually, it's a super interesting question, and it actually it stems much further back than that. But that's something that I understand with a hindsight, 2020 hindsight view, as they say. But I was first exposed to instruction in the military at around 2008. I was in Afghanistan in the British Area of Operations, Helmand Province, and at that time I was an expert in um, improvised explosive device search specifically. So every time somebody would come into theatre and they needed to be told about, hey, what's out there, what's lurking in the ground, what's looking for you, what is the threat, how do you counter that threat? So for me, having never been an instructor or even stood up in front of people, I was kind of thrust into that limelight again in a very high stakes sort of situation. It's like you're the guy on the ground, you know the score, so you need to teach these people coming in. And this was something that all of us would have to do. But it's when I understood that I had, I suppose, a natural flair, I would say, for instructing. But more than that, it's it, it's something that felt right in me. It's like, oh, I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my time. Now, when I said the 2020 hindsight vision, looking further back, um, I actually had a very difficult school career, shall we call it that. I don't learn in a sort of generic way. That sort of generic way where you sit down. Back then, of course, there was no IT. It was literally a chalkboard. And I'm not as old as I'm making out, by the way. But that very sort of sit, listen. You're told one way information. Write it down. Remember it. That's not a great way of learning. Certainly not for me. And I found also when I joined the army, the back end of 1999. I was receiving the exact same sort of old school, shall we say, um, way of learning or being taught, but you're really just being told. I wasn't actually learning a lot. So actually, when I started to delve into learning and applying my own lens to it and really trying to um, cater to a much wider audience of learners, that's when I started to delve into the science behind it. And that's when I realized, wow, this is for me. And I really love doing this. So actually I'd had the army to thank for the exposure, the initial exposure. And then I would say the deep rooted science and experience that then followed for the best part of 20 years. So if that's all right for your question.
That's great. No, that's awesome. I did want to just touch base on that. So with your operational experience and teaching something that is literally life and death to people, do you think that somewhat reinforced the instruction and going, okay, I'm teaching something that matters? And do you think that if you were to, say, step into a role that wasn't so, say, interesting and life and death, that you may have, like if you were teaching, I don't know, sandbagging on something on a promotion course, something less, it's the least sexy thing I could think of, but it's probably a bad example. But if you're teaching something that was a bit boring or whatever, do you think you might not have been captured in the same way, or do you think you still would have?
That's a really good question. Hey, sandbags are important, very safe to life.
They are. They can be life and death. Absolutely.
Exactly. That's a really good question.
Maybe 10 poles. I don't know. Something boring.
Yeah. Excellent question. It's nothing I've considered before. So I'm going to say that I probably would have loved it just as much. With that said, my learning and development career, and it's really been through the full life cycle of learning. It really started with that delivery specialization. And I was an instructor at the Combat Engineer School in the UK, and I was teaching literally sandbags, right? You're right. It was pretty dry, but there's something I was told when I went through my instructor development courses, and that's something the British military do very, very well. They don't just send anybody to the training school because they're a liability in a unit, say. They send people who have shown a shall we say, an aptitude for training, and then they really do develop you. And one of the key things that really stuck with me is if a subject's dry, or if you've taught it 500 times, you must teach it with the same enthusiasm as if you're teaching it for the first time, because it's the first time that the audience is hearing it. So actually, I think that understanding of the importance and that it's not about you, it's about them, that allowed me to sort of throw my everything into instructing no matter what the subject was.
That's a really good point. And I've seen a lot of stuff just in the self-help space around learning and emotional activation as a key trigger for the actual, I guess, absorption of whatever you're trying to teach. Did you find that and having to really amp it up? So if you're teaching something dry, don't teach it in a dry way, really try and get people involved and invested?
100%. And actually, I talked earlier about that, the sort of the old school learning system. And what we're talking about there is pedagogy. And that's kind of like, you're a child, I'm an adult, I'm teaching you this because you need to know it. And that's all they need to know. But what we're talking about really now is pedagogy. And what we're talking about is adult learning principles. And if you say, look, I know that you've been an instructor yourself in a military setting. If you say to somebody, I'm teaching you this and you need to know it, if you're an adult, that is not going to wash. So you really do have to engage with your target audience. But it's more than engaging. You have to give them a genuine reason. This is why you need to know this. And they need to believe it. And they need to be motivated by that themselves. What I found was in those years, whilst, say, Afghanistan was still very much on a warfighting footing, it was very, very easy to engage a target audience just by throwing in a small, and we did this in Afghanistan, and this is the way we would do it in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And then straight away they're like, okay, well, I'm going to go there, so I need to know this. So that's one way. And it could be other sort of extrinsic motivators. It could be, hey, this is a promotion course, and if you do this, you're going to get more money, etc., etc. You just have to find what it is for that target audience to give them the hook, as you were so saying in the question.
Yeah, I find that reason is super important. Do you think that, so you're saying you didn't do very well academically. I can definitely absolutely relate to that. You've then since rectified that with getting a master's degree, correct? So tell me a little bit about that and how going from not being an academic student in school to then getting a master's degree, a lot of people would be like, well, that's quite a jump. How did that shape up?
Yes, it is a jump. You're right. So I guess the UK equivalent to the Australian sort of school system, we get something called GCSEs, which is about equivalent to year 10, okay? Because we leave school a little bit earlier and the likes. So actually, for the longest time, my year 10 failed exams were about the best that I had. However, in the British military, you are forced to redo your schooling at a basic level. I would say at a fundamental practical level, so you don't learn about things you wouldn't use in real life, right? But you'll have to do numeracy, literacy at a level commensurate to the rank that you're about to undertake. So at corporal, for example, you would do a lower bar, and then a sergeant, where you're probably going to be communicating up and down the chain of command, or you're going to be writing reports, things like that. You would have to go back and do it a little bit more. So actually, throughout my career, I sort of caught up, shall we say, on the basic fundamental education that I didn't really receive as a child. But the masters, it came much later. Actually, I was probably somewhere near around 40 years old when I actually completed that. And one thing I like to say is that education is wasted on the young. So, we go through a school
That's
system.
good.
Right. Thank you. We go through a school system, right, where actually, if you really strip it back and say, right, what is the purpose of schooling? Why is a government, and I'm to a fault apolitical, so I'm not going down a political line here, but in the UK, why are we so stringent on a school system? Why do children, must they be in school? Really, it's about the economy, right? So that the parents can be in work. And it's more of a child care system than is an education system. It's more about social development as it is about education. When I was 15, 16, when I left the school system in the UK, I knew I wanted to be a soldier, but I didn't know what I really wanted to do at a deep level. And I actually didn't figure that out until I was into my 30s, late 30s. And that's when I say heterogogy comes in, because now I'm motivated. There's something that I want to be. There's something that I want to do with my life. At that time, actually, I wanted to be an education officer, from sort of grunt engineer to an education officer. Well, what's the gateway? Well, I need higher education. So if I'm motivated, I've got years in the workforce experience. Now I can do a master's degree quite easily. And that I found was the case.
Yeah, it's so true. I can definitely relate to that. Yeah, absolutely. On a similar journey to yours, didn't do terrifically well in school. I finished year 12 and then later went and got my master's. And I think it's the why. I think the why was so much stronger later on, as I was like, well, this means I could potentially get a high paying job or whatever. I think this is such a useful skill in this day and age. So it was all these reasons that allowed me to keep going. Not to mention, I think I'd bred better focus habits, just better discipline around it. I do assignments early rather than leaving to the last minute. I think that maturity and I love that line you said, education is wasted on the young. I think it's so true.
Right. I mean, of course, I don't mean that exclusively. There's some young people who have incredible, academic careers and more power to them. But for the rest of us, I just felt like it was wasted on me because of the things you just talked about, my level of maturity, my readiness, my discipline or lack thereof. So actually, I find that military service is highly compatible with personal development and developing people at the right time when they're ready for it.
I think that's so true. And I definitely want to touch back on that in the personal development and military space, particularly as it comes to young people. So hopefully I don't forget. But I love to go back to your time as an instructor, particularly in Australia, because working with you, you were 100% one of the best military instructors that I've ever worked with.
Thank you.
And can you tell us a little bit about your time in the Australian military? And I don't want to get in here and start throwing shade about either of our respective militaries. But I remember you coming and giving a lesson to the School of Military Engineering, and and you just blew everybody's minds. Everybody was like, this is the most amazing thing. And you almost revolutionized the instruction at the school for a short time. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Thank you. That's very high praise. I'd like to. It's nice if that's true. I will put it that way. You know what I think it comes back to, and I don't want to throw shade at either militaries because there's definitely pluses and minuses about both of them, sometimes almost in the same space. But what I would say is the fundamental difference, and I touched on it earlier, my career to instructor was actually built on a very, very strong sort of foundation that, in my experience, didn't exist in the Australian Army. And I will even go as far to say that it doesn't exist across the board in the British Army either. So different arms, corps, regiments, they'll all do it in their own sort of way, almost like a cottage industry, if you like. But fortunately, the Royal Engineers really threw a lot of weight, time, resource behind that next generation instructor. So I think they really understood that, your top 10% cohorts should become the next instructor, because then they're going to breed the next top 10% of cohorts, right? I know that in other instances, I've seen it, I've lived it, I've seen it in the Australian Defence Force at the School of Military Engineering. I've seen a little bit of, you're just going off to the school. Oh, why? Because we said so. And then the person doesn't want to be an instructor. They don't have the right qualities to be an instructor. What you will find is that even now in the corporate world, learning and development, nobody does that on purpose. You always fall into learning and development, right? It's almost a subset of the larger umbrella of HR. And probably because everybody's been to school, they've been through education, they actually think they know learning. Like, oh, sure, learning, I've done some of that. I, therefore, am an expert in this field. Is not the case. And I think the Australian Army kind of prescribed to that a little bit. Like, just go and teach people, like it's not a valuable technical skill set unto its own, which of course I will argue that it is. And that was really developed for me in the British Army from that sort of corporal level, shall we say. That's where I went away and I learned how to instruct, literally how to impart information onto people so that so I catered for their learning styles, their needs. And that's that really sort of cold face, technical learning acumen, I suppose. But then, as you go up through the rank system, and we know that the military is a very linear sort of career path, right? Each time you go up the ladder, you get exposed to a different skill set. And so by the time I left instructing in the military, I was no longer just an instructor, but I was actually, you will probably say, the owner for that capability. In the Australian Army, for example, it was high risk search, and I was the lead for training on all high risk search. No longer was I in a classroom, but I was back of house, looking at the curriculum, looking at the lessons, looking at the lesson plans, trying to just make sure that we were moving with times, trying to make sure that learning was impactful. So I think, and it was a very long-winded answer to your question, Luke, it started from excellent foundations in the British military, certain foundations I didn't see in the Australian Defence Force, unfortunately. And I think that's why I might have blown minds. I wasn't special. I was just well taught. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It is definitely not a thing you're selected for, like it is in other areas. You'd be pleased to know that in certain areas of the ADF, there is that selection for it. Like I know the School of Infantry and the Combat Shooting Cell, they very closely hold that instructor position, and you need to be recommended for it when you do your combat shooting instructor course. So there are aspects of it, whereas generally across the board for most things, I think it is very much like you're qualified, now you can teach, which that's just because you have the technical qualification doesn't mean you're competent enough to impart your knowledge to the next generation of learners.
Right, which in itself is a technical ability and a skill set, right?
Yes, which is a technical, So your point is that it's a technical skill set of instruction itself, not just the technical skill set of the thing you're teaching.
Exactly that. In fact, I would even argue, if you're physically instructing on the ground at the coal face, yes, I would argue that it's very, very advantageous to have a deep understanding and experience of the skill set that you are actually imparting, right? But further up in learning, I would actually say it can be a bit of a disadvantage, because really to design, develop, to understand learning need, to understand what is it that we need to impart, what is the return on expectation, sometimes it's a disadvantage to actually have the underlying knowledge, because really excellent learning design is based on collaboration with the right people. And it's about taking the right gems of information. Now, if I come into that role already with a preconceived idea of what good should look like, there's going to be unconscious at best or conscious bias in the mix. So really, at a technical level, yeah, you should have that skill. But at an operational strategic level, it's better that you are purely a learning person and you don't know the subject at all. That's what I find in the corporate world.
Right. Oh, wow. So you're saying that less technical ability in the skill set actually breeds better instruction.
100%. Yeah, yeah, across the whole life cycle of
Wow.
learning development. Because really, like I say, it should be a collaborative thing, right? So what you really want to do is
Yeah.
you need to balance your very, very niche, and it is niche, even within the world of HR. True learning development professionals are actually a little bit like rocking horse proverbial. And we just need to understand everything about learning, and we need to take the gems of information from the SMEs in the room about the subject matter itself. That's the best way to do it, I find.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. Do you think the adage "if you can't do, teach" then applies?
I was gonna, I was gonna laugh about that one earlier. Yeah, it's a funny thing. Um, Actually, it did apply for me when I was a combat engineer instructor, and it wasn't the case of can't do. It was a case of I don't like doing it. So, you know, in my career, I've been a combat engineer on operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and sure, it had some exciting sort of aspects to it, and I enjoyed some of it operationally. But generally speaking, and you'll understand this yourself, Luke, as an ex-military engineer, there's nothing fun about staying up all night hand building a bridge in the rain, sideways rain, just to strip it out again at the end. Right? It's not fun. So I didn't enjoy being a combat engineer, but I loved teaching it. Right? So could do, didn't like doing it, can teach. That was my philosophy.
No, well, I think the world's a better place for you moving into that instructional role. So that's really good. How do you find the corporate world differs from military in instruction, and is one better than the other?
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Now listen, we'll have to temper that I haven't seen the entirety of the corporate world, right? I've been in two pretty
Yeah.
large corporate organizations. First of all, I absolute privilege to work for Deloitte in Canberra. But again, they did everything extremely well, I found. And then of course now, as I said, I'm within a defense industry prime. Um, I walked into the defense industry prime thinking it would be uh, as swept up in this space as the military. And what I've learned as a consultant at Deloitte, going into other organizations, large, complex, federated, and even in the current one I'm in now, nobody does the back of house administration doctrine quite like the military. So what am I talking about? In the Australian Army, they would, um, stick quite religiously to saddle ADDI, or Systems Approach to Defense Learning, and ADDI is just really an acronym for the life cycle of learning, and it's talking about an analysis of your learning, yeah, the design, the development, the implementation, and then its evaluation for effectiveness is kind of a circular thing, right? Now, it made a lot of sense to me when I was exposed to that. The UK version of that is called GSP 822, and they are amazingly detailed. Probably too prescriptive, certainly for a more faster sort of paced corporate environment. But on the flip of the coin, what I see in corporate is a complete lack of that structure, of that. This is what we follow, or this is how we do it. And it's a bit more of a free for all. And I don't think that's good for business. And I don't think that's good for the learner, the end the learner experience, right? You want a consistent, well structured way of doing things, an operating model, if you like. And I find that the Army do that brilliantly. The corporate side, less so, but I find that the corporate have a lot more resource to throw at the problem, and the military less so. So 6 and 1, half a dozen of the other, you might say.
Yeah, I think they're also training and selecting for different outcomes a little bit too. Armies obviously need to get a baseline of performance out of a broad spectrum range of people and a lot of physical skills and often technical. But whereas corporates seem to be, I mean, you probably get still such a broad range in the corporate space. I'm probably pigeonholing a little bit here. But yeah, I think there's probably a little bit of difference there, do you think?
Yeah, actually, I think you just touched on something really, really well. So you talked about that broad spectrum, but you talked about that technical training, and that's really what I would call role specific or SQUEC, which is your suitably qualified and experienced personnel, right? So this is your role. This is the training pathway that you need. And again, I think the military is really at the top of the tree from what I've seen when it comes to this is where I am now, this is where I'm getting to, and this is the pathway to get there, right? Learning pathways that are deeply ingrained into competency or skills frameworks that are well documented. Fantastic. The Army do that really, really well. Now, at the same time, when it comes to that technical SQUEC, they do that quite well in corporate. I haven't seen it as well as the military, but in corporate, what they really tend to do is they understand the squiggly career, right? Which we don't do well in the military. In the military, it's very linear, as you know. You start at the bottom, and you will work and work and work until you get to the top. Whereas actually on this side of the fence, they will actually look for someone's full potential and try to unlock it as early as possible. And that means they will move you into positions and give you opportunities to develop, not depending on how long you've served or a very linear pathway, but agnostic of how you've got those skills, they will use them. So that will mean, I guess in a military term, you're going from private straight to captain overnight because your skills are commensurate to that role. That's what we don't do well in the military, whereas in corporate they do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the example would be, so obviously my wife's been corporate for a long time, and it seems like they'll move you into different roles and areas and be like, well, actually, we want you up here to run the organization one day, or we think you're on that path. So here's a role in logistics, here's a role in marketing, here's a role in sales, and you get a bit of a broad smattering of what you do. But the military doesn't do that because you lock into a job, right? You'll never do, oh, here's like a year at engineers and here's a year at infantry. Like, we want to round you out and actually broaden your skill set for a military perspective. It's very much, they say they do, but it just is different types of roles in the same job that they get you to and call it broadening.
Yeah. So it's like a career stream, right? Rather than a specific role, it's a series of roles, but tightly bound within a sort of tight career pathway of specialization. And actually, you might argue, or you can certainly argue, that there's pros and cons to both of those things, right? If you're going to be moving around a little bit too quickly, particularly into areas way outside of your comfort zone, then sure, there's going to be a lot of imposter syndrome. There's going to be a lot of catching up to do, a lot of upskilling, reskilling, and that's the sort of terminology we use. Or I guess in that type pipeline, you really know what sort of skills that you need to hit at every single level, and they've been mapped out for years ahead of the time you get there. Wonderful. But again, if you think about now, you think about the linear career pathway of defense, and then you also think how fast the nature of warfare and hybrid warfare is changing. Do we have time to build people in a very linear fashion these days? Or do we find that new capabilities are coming all the time, like drone or like EW, et cetera, and we need the right people with the right skills just to get into those roles? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. It's massive. And I think the Pareto principle could kind of help with that. I think the 80-20 rule is like 20% of the stuff you do 80% of the time. So what's that 80-20? And it's what's going to be the biggest lever. I feel like the military likes to tick every single box, and that can be compliance and it can be safety. And I find it's a little bit like build a bridge by night, build a bridge by bad weather. Like, you know what I mean? Like build this type of bridge, now build the other bridge. It's like maybe if you get the understanding of one, you don't need to build it in every single configuration because that's a huge time waster. So I would argue that what's the 20% that you're going to do 80% of the time, work on that, and then you can build the other stuff as you need, just in time. Or
very good, just in time. Yeah, excellent use of proper L&D language there. So well done for that one. Exactly that. Rather than just teaching everything right there at one point, you do it just in time at the point of need, right? And you know what you've just said about the 80-20, it's do the basics well. Yeah. But again, I do wonder if there is time for that these days. I mean, you think about how quickly, you know, certainly over here in this side of the planet, you look at the battlefield in the Ukraine, and do you have time to sort of focus on, well, this is what we're going to do 80% of the time, when what you're doing 80% of the time is changing week on week. So there is an argument to say that actually we probably need to be much more agile in the way we upskill, reskill, rethink, retrain. So that's kind of like where my brain is at the moment in terms of the future of learning, particularly in a military context.
I think that's a really good point. What would you do if you were in charge of instructor development or learning development for ADF and the UK Army? What would you change? What would be your biggest implementations?
Instructor development, you say? Just like, yeah, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, look, I really do like the system. I like the system a lot, and I wouldn't change an awful lot, apart from, like I've just sort of been talking about, is incredibly linear. And what we really never do is we never understand what people's skills they've already got, agnostic of how they got those. We never sort of allow them to showcase that, or we never allow them to utilize that for the, you know, to better the force. Some of these people are a real force multiplier, and I suppose the way they do it at the moment is, sure, if you was a tradie in City Street, that might allow you to accelerate your tradie training within the military. But again, they only do that in very small numbers, and they don't do it very well. What I'm talking about is if I was, you know, the head of our training establishments, or even organizational mapping, I would be saying, I'm looking at your skills that you've already earned, that you already have. So I'm taking, you know, a cyber security expert from NAB, and I'm putting them straight into a role very, very high up in the system, straight in at that, you know, OF4 or F5 level, if it's commensurate to their skills. But we don't do that. We just train in the same linear fashion that we build our workforce. And that's something that I would look to change if I was holding the cards, shall we say.
No, that's a really good, interesting point. Do you think is there a single attribute or a couple of attributes that you think make for really good instructors? Could you pick out a commonality one?
Caring about it, caring about the people that you're teaching. Yeah, I said it earlier. I said that nobody tends to fall into L&D, particularly corporate L&D, right? Yes, you have people who straight out of school, university, go into formal education. They know that they're going to be school teachers, right? But education and learning development is very closely related, but they are two different things. So actually, the people who fall into it and fall in love with it are the people who really care about it, who are passionate about it, aren't doing it to meet a business end, but are doing it because they love to see that the knowledge and parts that they love to see the people grow, as we did, you know, when we were instructors together at the School of Military Engineering in Sydney. I used to love taking that raw product and then watching them at the end. You could see the difference. And if you don't love that, then you're in the wrong job. So that's, I think, first and foremost, that's the common ingredient to making a great instructor, or laterally down the line, learning development professional.
That's a really good point. I think of so many times And yeah, I think that shone through, particularly when we worked together. I think it's true. I think having a deep care of not only the people, but of their learning, I think it's super important. But man, there were some really standout times. Can you tell the story about the time during? I don't want to be I don't want to be mean about anybody in trainees or whatever, but there's some funny stories that pop up. Can you tell the story about when you were doing a BFA and the one trainee had the heart problem?
Oh, Luke. Okay, so for those who don't know, yeah, we were doing, what is it, like a 2.4K, right? Here we call it a 1.5 mile run. So doing a 2.4K run, and I remember I'd already finished because I was a bit of a racing snake at the time, and I was standing at the finish line waiting for our trainees to make it over the line. And one of our young private soldiers said, "Oh, excuse me, Sergeant, but Private Blogs, he's over there. He's got a bit of a problem. His heart has stopped." So we had a clinically dead trainee at the other side of the track who I could see was still running. And then when he made it to the finish line, he said, "Oh no, but it's all right now." So that was a close call for us that day. Yeah, we had a dead man running. Funny times, man.
I think it's so funny. And I think we were absolutely remiss in our duties. We didn't call, I don't know, one of the learning hospitals or a university to say that we've had a medical breakthrough, that someone's heart had stopped, and yet they were running and talking, and I couldn't believe it. It was some kind of vampire thing that I'm sure medical science still hasn't caught up with an explanation for that, but...
No, my own explanation, I think, is any excuse to not pass the minimum standard. Of course, we watched them people grow, and they all passed in the end, no doubt.
Yeah. So every generation, I think, says that, hey, this generation's not as tough or as strong or as fit or smart or whatever. I mean, that's just I think has happened. We've passed that baton down from generation to generation. I'm sure cavemen were saying the new generation of cavemen are not up to standard. But how do you find the different generations and particularly noting from when you joined to as you became an instructor to what you see now, how has that shifted across the generations, do you think?
Yeah. And I would almost have the opposite view. And I would say that, and rightly so, as time rolls on and we understand a little bit more about human behaviors in organizations specifically, as well as we understand more about how people learn, and we start to become a bit more open on how we facilitate that in the training environment, then I'm finding that actually we're unlocking the potential of our soldiers at a much higher rate than, shall we say, that the culture will allow us to keep up with. A little bit of a saying that I hear often is that culture eats policy or process for breakfast. Okay, so no matter how good we are at unlocking the potential of our people, they'll probably find that their culture will keep them in their box because I am corporal and you are private. Do as you are told. But actually, if we could unlock that, you would probably see that we have a much better standard of soldier because we're giving them that opportunity and we're letting them learn in a much more dynamic way. As I said, when I went through training, it was a corporal who was probably not that interested in being an instructor back then, who was literally just reading verbatim from a PAM at the front, but yet they would claim that we are the best generation, right? But now if we can start right, so if we can start to create a much better learning experience, look, you can use umpteen different models, but I guess a very sort of ubiquitous and classic model is 70-20-10, and that 10% of the time that you're learning is that formal learning. Back then it was someone reading verbatim from a PAM, or in our day it was us actually taking them out of the training area. We dug in, dummy IEDs, and we got them to find them in a systematic way. But then you couple that with 20% of exposure to that sort of peer learning, or even that coaching, mentoring piece, which is much bigger than it ever has been in the military. That when it first came in, we called the pink fluffy stuff. right? That nobody was interested in, and it's revolutionized learning. And then it's 70% experiential, and that's about creating. And if we can culturally do this, it's about creating that psychologically safe environment where it's not only okay to fail, but it's expected that you learn by failing experientially. When we get that right, I think we haven't just got a generation that's not as good as my generation. We've got a generation that's potentially so much better. Our generation just has to get out of the way and allow that to happen.
Yeah, that's so many good points that I'd love to delve into there. But one that jumps out at me is that fear of failure. The military really breeds that, I think, because it's such a bad thing, and you got to get re-rolled or go back squatted or a retest, and there's so much shame around it. But I think failure is such a pivotal learning tool. I've got this concept, and it's, in Harry Potter, in the Deathly Hallows, where they've got it was a strap in, hang on, I'll loop this back. But in the Deathly Hallows, where they've got the three brothers, and Death, meets them or whatever, and they beat Death, and he's like, all right, everyone gets a tool. One gets the wand, one gets the invisibility cloak, and one gets the resurrection stone. Anyway, and then the guy with the invisibility cloak evades death for his whole life and then greets him like an old friend. I think we should greet failure like an old friend. I think we should be like, hey, failure is such a good learning tool, and it's how you learn, it's how you grow. There's so much personal development in failing something and learning to overcome that and not quit from that I think it's like, I just love that idea of treat failure like an old friend. Don't treat it like this big boogeyman.
Absolutely. And you know what? The military is particularly bad, even compared to corporate, but corporate is a long way away, in my experience, from allowing that failure, right? Especially when you think time is money, and in business, really, that's the bottom line, right? But we talk about it. We talk a good game in that regard, and we definitely do need to greet it like an old friend, like you say. But actually, you can put controls around that, right? What we don't want is catastrophic failure. So in an organization like mine that makes fighter jets and nuclear submarines, we don't want to be creating failures that's going to create a safety to life issue. But we do want to create a training environment where we've got almost a safe failure mechanism built around it. And I think the reason that we don't do it well in the army is, one, because of the macho sort of a culture around it. But also think a lot of the guys and girls and who join the army they're pretty young, right? And it's kind of almost like a schoolyard mentality, particularly in those training schools, right? So there's a lot of saving face and a lot of embarrassment around failure. Not so much the systems in place. If you fail, you'll have to do X again. It's, I don't want to fail in front of these people because it's embarrassing. So actually, what I probably didn't mention earlier is that I actually still am affiliated to the military. I'm now a captain in the reserves in the UK, and I'm actually a training officer. Big shock. But I went on a course for 2 weeks quite recently, and when we introduced ourselves, we were asked to introduce ourselves in our military role and our civilian role. And I finished introducing myself by saying, and on the rest of this course, can we please normalize asking stupid questions? And that set the bar immediately from the start of the course. And what actually I found that I had to do was ask a few, like straight off the bat, just to sort of not just say it, but do it. And over the couple of days, people became really comfortable with asking what could be deemed as stupid questions around what was actually a very complex subject. Whereas I found that a lot of people in the room would have just kept quiet. Even at 40 years old, I'll just keep quiet so I look stupid. You cannot learn if you don't ask questions. And if you're asking a question, everyone else was thinking it. That's the truth.
It's so true. And you've along this conversation, you've triggered a couple of core memories of mine, core military memories. One of which is being at, say, basic training and someone asking a dumb question or a red herring question, and the instructor like jumping on it, being like, that's a dumb question. That's a red herring. Like, that's got nothing to do. And in some cases it could be warranted because you're talking about military policy, and then someone goes, Corporal, what's the best thing about an Abrams tank? And they'd be like, bro, we're not talking about that right now.
Right.
So sometimes sometimes the instructor gets rightfully like, hey, let's stay on topic. But I would argue they do it on a more gentle role. But I remember the whole platoon or the whole class just being like eye rolls. And it's like, oh, what a dumb question. And everyone piles on. So that public shame is so strong there. That's massive.
100%. 100%. And actually, we've had the same stupid questions put at us that were completely random or off topic. But actually, in that key time when I was learning how to be instructor, that was one of the key principles that we were taught to deal with. And actually, even though you probably did find it irksome, you did find that it was distracting from the topic, you had to sort of come back and say, actually, that's a really interesting question. To be honest, it doesn't really relate to what we're doing right now, but let's talk about that a little later on. And that might seem a little bit forced or a little bit unnatural. But if you look at the flip side and I know you will have experienced, what I certainly experienced is somebody asks a question, they get called out in front of everybody. Everyone's eye rolling and laughing at them. The corporal instructors got angry at them. And then they'll finish their lesson by saying, okay, any questions? Of course there's no questions.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to be ridiculed, all right? So you always have to pose a stupid question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so good. The other one, and it's kind of a little bit of a digression, but I wanted to bring it up because it was just such a core memory and a cringe, was when you were talking about the instructor just sitting up there reading from the PAM. My other favorite one was, all right, you read the first sentence, and then you go down, all right, you read the second sentence. So it's where the instructor doesn't even read from the PAM. Yeah, you just get everyone else to read from the PAM, and everyone's just sitting there like...
So the reason why I'm laughing at that particularly is when I first transferred to the Australian Defence Force, myself and somebody else who works with you and I, he just transferred in from the Canadian military. Of course, we needed to be brought up to speed on the Australian Defence Force, and two very experienced warrant officers stood at the front of the class and had myself and my colleague read the entire slide pack, one slide at a time. So yeah, we essentially did their bad job for them. And hey, look, I am being a bit facetious, and I don't mean to be, but really, I think that arcs back to your question earlier: is where have we come from and where are we going? These two, what senior warrant officers, they didn't know any better. They're simply modeling the behaviours that they've seen throughout their formative years, right? So when I say if we can just get the culture out of the way and we can model the correct behaviors that, by the way, are evolving continually, what I think is good practice today is certainly not going to be good practice next year. That's how we need to do it. And those horror stories will slowly but surely creep away, I think.
I hope so. I hope so. So speaking of the next generation, would you recommend young people join the military today?
Question. Depends. Right. It really depends. Obviously I know that, and again, I'm apolitical to a fault. I really am. And that's I think a hangover of being a lifelong soldier where politics wasn't our bag. You just got to do what you're asked to do. I know that there's a political shift, certainly from the US side towards, the Indo-Pacific. And I know that there's eyes on what's happening down in that side of the world. But then here on my side of the equator, there's actual war right now, not thousands and thousands of miles away, not far away at all, right? War is here. I'm a father of two young boys. Let's say if the balloon went up in, say, 2027, which is something that they talk about, and let's say if it's going to be a protracted war that we've seen previously, and that look, the stalemate and the Ukraine sort of borders right now would suggest that it probably would be a protracted war. Well, then I have children who are quite liable to call up. Now, I've heard you say this yourself. I think when you're younger, you're much happier to take that risk. But when you're a father, your purview is very, very different. So would I want children to join the army now? I don't just ask that about children. I ask that about my children. And for all of the pros from the military, the way it can develop you in your confidence, your being, your person, the master's degrees, all those sorts of things, do I want my children to be digging in the Ukraine? Not really. So is that a bit of a cop-out answer?
No, absolutely not. I think it's such a good answer, and it's something that I've struggled with too. I mean, I think about this a lot. Would I recommend my boys do it? And I completely agree. I think it's hard. I think the military is just it can be such a positive experience. It has been for yourself, clearly, and it has been for myself. Like, not obviously, it hasn't all been roses. Like, I'm sure we've both had our issues, with our military service and particularly operational deployments and things like that. But on the whole, do I think it's been positive in my life? It's definitely been great for upward mobility. I mean, both of us working class backgrounds have now done a lot better than what we possibly could have. I mean, you never know. You don't know the counterfactual, but for all those positives, I completely agree. And I think there's something about the war that we fought, or the wars that we fought. There's multiple in our time, but that's different to a big war of attrition, total war. Like, that's a completely different ball game, and that's something that I don't know that I would wish on my kids. And exactly. It's something that I seriously think about. And the drone warfare and the new technologies and the RNA possibilities for biologicals and all of like the new and evolving technology when it comes to warfare is scary, to be honest. So yeah, I'm completely in the same boat. I'm torn on the subject.
But then, to frame it from a different perspective, and like you just pointed out, we've been through it in a very different time. But when I joined the British Army, the big sort of things in the news was sort of the tail end of the troubles in Northern Ireland, or it was sort of KFOR, like Kosovo, Bosnia. That's what we're talking about, right, in the 90s. And then, I mean, I'm older than I wish to sort of admit, but then I was already in the army at the 9/11. I was already a soldier then, and that changed everything overnight, right? And then we went into this very protracted sort of counterinsurgency way of operating. I was in Iraq when attention shifted back to Iraq. Then I was in the Helmand province during that time, and it was an adventure, and it felt like an adventure. And there's some horrific injuries, and there was a lot of death, but not on the scale that we're sort of seeing that. So yes, we've come from a different time. So I think we've been very fortunate to have our Peter Pan moment. We've had our adventures, but we've been incredibly fortunate to have been raised by the discipline and personally developed, paid for a master's degree, etc., etc. Brilliant, and I wouldn't turn my sons away from that career, right? I'd say go there, learn, grow. And in fact, if I could be if I could have a magic wand and I could sort of make any sort of changes, I would probably make everyone do some sort of civic duty, right? It doesn't necessarily mean military training, but it means some sort of civic duty, whether that's in health, education, or defence. The three things that are quite dear to most of us. I would probably say go and do that, and you're not allowed to do it in your own hometown either. Go, move away. Not necessarily overseas, but move away. Don't be around the same people, your family, your network, your crutch. Go and develop. And I think the army, for me, did that better than anyone else could have done. So that I would absolutely say go for it. But we do have to balance that with the realities of war, and that's the less glamorous side of the military, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think also from a social perspective, it can be really good. I think young men particularly, there's a increasing talk about men being cast aside. I don't want to go into the manosphere territory, but there's definitely a lot of disenfranchised young men out there that are looking for that, I think, and unfortunately sometimes they can find that in the wrong places or in some forms of influencers and coaches and mentors that are potentially a little bit problematic or toxic. And I think the military, whilst sometimes can be problematic and toxic, on the whole, it's generally a pretty good experience, right? And I think it could be a a very positive social thing for young men to do. And I think you're right about the civic duty and volunteering. I think there needs to be some kind of purpose, something that gives you something more than yourself to think about. That's not, I don't know, porn or video games in your own bedroom. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I think actually, I talked about it earlier. What I've actually done is I left the Australian military, and I suppose that I would call a period of cold turkey, where I had 2 years where I wasn't affiliated to the military in any way. And what I found myself was every single time there was a ball or a party or a dine out, I was there, right? And I just found myself constantly on the phone. Hey, who wants to go mountaineering in Wales this weekend or Scotland? You know, we're very fortunate where we live that both are pretty close by. And it was always gravitating back to those guys who I shared those experiences with, Afghanistan, Iraq, because there's more of a connection with these people, probably quite obviously, than there is with pretty much anyone else. And then when the end of this sort of 2 years of cold turkey, I forced my way back in because I just can't let it go. Do you think I'm pushing my way back in case there's an off chance that I can build a bridge in the rain all night? Absolutely not. I'm doing it because of the social aspect, because there are people, and I do think what I learned about social development in the army is the best aspect of military service.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I've definitely found that as well, right? That you definitely tend to gravitate towards people with those shared experiences, and it can be hard to, I guess, relate and integrate post-military service into the broader community, because it just feels a bit different, as is my sense, is how I've kind of envisaged it. And not that I really want to delve too deep into the mental health rabbit hole. It's neither one of our particular wheelhouse, but what do you think has helped you in terms of you reintegrating? And I know you're kind of stepping back into the fold a little bit, but in living your life post-military service or post-full-time military service, what's helped you massively or mostly with your mental health and integration and all of those things?
Yeah, I actually think I just touched on it a little bit. In that, even in that time when I wasn't directly involved in the military, I was involved with people, and whether that's sharing a mountainside for the day, or going on a long walk, or whatever it is, it was just being around the people who I felt like understood me, and the people I understand. And I think, although I'm busy, very very busy with my job, I think what do they say? Idle hands and the devil's work. So I think it's having something to do, and a way that I connected with that sort of military is custom picture framing. Actually, believe it or not, which is a bit of a strange little hobby to have, but the military, they are the vainest group, the vainest demographic, and if they can stick a picture with their medals on the wall for everyone to see, then they'll do it. So I've taken to making those, and actually what I find is it takes me away from the stresses of my corporate life. It takes me away from all of those things that I'm missing, and I can just get involved. I tend to stick to a military theme. It feels like I'm still sort of in the gang. I'm creating something with my hands. That's what I do, really. I just make sure that I'm not idle, and I sort of cling to the military in any way that I can. It's very much a part of my identity forever.
I think that's great. I think absolutely. I think that's such a powerful thing. I've heard a lot of that from a lot of people, is saying being creative, building something, kind of making things, whether that's, I've heard people making chairs and doing woodwork and finding that incredibly valuable, making knives, all of these different types of things. And I think picture framing is another one. It's great because you've got that military link, and potentially a lucrative side hustle as well. I mean, I tried to get some framing done recently and just absolutely nearly fell off my chair when I found the price out. So that's potentially a good one for a side hustle.
Did you make the chair yourself? Or?
Yeah, yeah, that's why it fell off. It's horribly made. I'm a terrible carpenter.
Yeah, like the Homer Simpson spice rack. So actually, a similar story. I had a couple of picture frames made up in the local town, and one from my sort of airborne forces career, and I was also a military diver. And I waited for 3 months for these pieces of work, and I paid probably 700 Australian. And that's when I thought, oh, hang on a minute, there's something in this. But actually, I found that every single piece that I've made it for people that I know for a cost, and I'm not doing it for the money, as it's turned out. I'm doing it for the feel good and something to do. And I think that's for mental health. And you were so right to caveat, this is not my wheelhouse, but it's what works for me.
Back to your military career as a whole, do you have any highlights? Like what was the top experiences that you've had?
Oof. How do you wrap 26 years into okay.
It's a tough question. It's hard.
It is a tough question. It is a tough question. I mean, look, probably typically everyone's going to say it's those times where you really had to find your resilience, and that's probably those operational theatres in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course. But I actually see that the Australian Defence Force was almost a reinvention for me. At that point, I'd done nearly 19 years. I was actually in much like yourself, a specialist area of the army. So you probably find that there's an arduous, tough selection process. That means that not many people come in, but not many people come out. So really, you're spending 19 years with the same people. And in some instances, that means you will be remembered for the less favorable things that you've done and never for the more favorable things that you've done. So actually, joining the Australian Army at 19 years, imagine joining a new job with a completely clean slate, but with 2 decades of corporate knowledge. It was pretty easy to shine, shall we say, in those 5 years of the ADF, and very quickly gained my master's degree. But then I also gained an officer's commission in the Australian Army, which I've carried over. So it's probably my standout was the will to go and start again and make a real good go of it. And I'm very, very proud of that. So thanks, ADF.
Well, I'm very glad you did. Because it's how we met, and working with you was a definite highlight of mine. So I definitely appreciate that. Do you have any hot takes or controversial takes or things that you think are true that most people would not think is true from your military time or across learning development or anything?
Yeah, I think I said it earlier on. From my, I've laboured it a lot. I think just because you've been through training or you've done some training or you've seen some training, that doesn't mean you know anything about learning and training. And I think that's my key hot take, is that within the military and without, at the tactical, operational and strategic level, learning is a specialist trade. And if you're going to do it and you're going to be the best at it, you can't pay it lip service. It's I'm finding that I'm playing the flag here right to the profession. So hopefully it'll
Absolutely. No, that's so good. Well, that's probably a great place to wrap it up. So, Chris, thank you. As I said, one of the best military instructors I've ever worked with. So, hugely grateful that you did come across to the ADF and we got to meet, and I got to learn a lot from you. It was such a great experience for me. And thanks very much for coming on and sharing your experience. I think it's super valuable. I've had a great time. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.